man delivering food to the gala was the one who built it. Nobody in that ballroom knew that. Not the 800 guests in their evening gowns and tailored tuxedos. Not the donors nursing their champagne under crystal chandeliers. Not the MC reading his teleprompter with practiced warmth. And certainly not the woman in the red dress who stopped him at the corridor and told him, loud enough to be heard, that delivery staff were not permitted through this entrance. Malcolm Bennett stood there, holding 2 thermal bags of food. He looked at the woman. He looked at the enormous LED screen above the ballroom stage, where a photograph of his late wife was being projected in soft light, her smile wide and unhurried, exactly the way he remembered it on Sunday mornings, before everything changed. Then he looked down at the event program, tucked under the arm of a passing guest. Naomi Bennett Children's Hope Foundation, founded by Celeste Harrington. His breath went somewhere it couldn't come back from right away. He had built that foundation in his kitchen. With Naomi. With 40 containers of food, and a dream she described while sitting cross-legged on their living room floor. And now her name was being broadcast across a room full of people who had never once fed a child in her name. While her husband stood at the service entrance, holding someone else's dinner order. Drop a comment, and let us know where you're watching from, because this story is about to go somewhere most people don't expect. The Saturday of the Ravenswood Grand Annual Gala began like every other Saturday in Malcolm Bennett's life, not with a mirror and a necktie, but with a 7-year-old climbing onto the foot of his bed at 6:45 in the morning, still holding Milo, the stuffed rabbit with the missing left ear that had once belonged to Naomi. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. I hear you, Ava. You weren't sleeping. I was resting." She crawled up beside him and put her small warm feet against his legs the way she always did, a ritual so ordinary and so essential that he had started to build his whole understanding of peace around it. Outside the window of their apartment on Crenshaw, the city was still gray and quiet. A trash truck groaned somewhere 2 blocks over. Malcolm lay there for another few minutes, Ava's breathing slowing back towards sleep against his shoulder, and he thought about nothing particular, just the sound of her. He had learned, in the 4 years since Naomi died, that peace was not something you found. It was something you built, carefully, around the edges of what remained. He was 39 years old. He had been a community operations coordinator for 12 years, the kind of work that put him in church basements and school cafeterias, and converted garages, organizing food drives, and after-school programs for kids whose parents worked double shifts and couldn't always be home before dark. He had loved that work the way some people love a calling, rather than a career. But after Naomi's diagnosis, and then after the 18 months of treatment, and then after the funeral and the legal affairs, and the 3-year-old, who kept asking when Mommy was coming home from the doctor, after all of that, he had stepped back from everything that required him to be present in the world, in ways he no longer had the capacity to sustain. He drove for a ride-share company 3 mornings a week. He picked up food delivery shifts on weekends, when Ava was at her grandmother's, or when she could come with him, which she often preferred. She would sit in the back seat with her homework folder on her lap and a granola bar, and ask him things about the city through the window. And those drives were, in their own quiet way, among the best hours of his life. The delivery app had assigned him 6 orders that Saturday. The last one was to a restaurant called Chez Marcello, and the drop-off address was the Ravenswood Grand Hotel. He had seen the name of the gala in the news that week. He had closed the tab without reading further. By 3 in the afternoon, Ava was at the kitchen table, doing multiplication worksheets while Malcolm made pasta, and looked at the bills, arranged in a small honest stack on the counter. The electricity, the car insurance, Ava's violin lessons which he had kept paying for, even when other things had to wait, because Naomi had been a music teacher and had wanted Ava to have that, and some things you didn't compromise on, even when the math argued otherwise. There was a shelf above the stove where he kept a few photographs. Naomi at their wedding, laughing at something off camera. The three of them at the beach the summer before her diagnosis, Ava still a toddler squinting into the sun. And one that was harder to look at directly. Malcolm and Naomi standing in front of a folding table, covered in aluminum food containers, both of them in jeans and old sweatshirts, Naomi pointing at the camera with a wooden spoon. That was the first Saturday they had served food, in the parking lot of the Meridian Community Center, on the east side, 40 meals. They had run out of rice. There was also a cardboard box on the closet shelf in Malcolm's bedroom, the kind that department stores pack winter coats in. He had moved it 3 times across 3 apartments, and had never once thrown it out. Inside were the original incorporation documents for Children's Hope, the name they had given the foundation, before Naomi got sick, and the board had quietly renamed it in her honor. There were handwritten budget notes in Naomi's looping script. A photograph of Grace Miller, who had shown up that first Saturday with her church's donation of canned goods, and had never quite left. A copy of the foundation bylaws, which included, in Article 14, Paragraph 3, a clause that stated clearly that the name and image of Naomi Bennett could not be used in any fundraising campaign or public-facing material without the written consent of her surviving spouse, or, in the event of his death or incapacity, the legal guardian of their child. Malcolm had never shown that clause to anyone since Celeste Harrington had started running the foundation's public operations. He had been too tired, too broken, too occupied with the daily work of keeping a small child alive and fed and feeling loved in a world that had taken her mother. He had trusted the board to hold the mission together. He had trusted the bylaws to speak for themselves. Ava looked up from her worksheet. "Daddy, is tonight the event where they talk about Mommy?" He kept stirring the pasta. "Maybe. I'm just making a delivery. We'll be in and out. Can I see her picture?" He turned around. She was watching him with those eyes that were so completely Naomi's, that sometimes the resemblance felt like something he had to brace himself against. "We'll see, baby," he said. "Eat your dinner first." She went back to her worksheet. He turned off the stove. It was 6:45 in the evening, when he loaded the thermal bags into the back seat of his car, and strapped Ava into her booster with Milo tucked under her arm and her homework folder on her lap, because she had 2 more problems to finish. The drive to the Ravenswood Grand took 22 minutes. He found the service entrance on the east side of the building, and parked near the loading dock. He told Ava he would be back in 10 minutes. "I know," she said, already writing. He grabbed the bags and walked toward the kitchen entrance. A kitchen worker in a white uniform pointed him toward a corridor that he followed for 40 feet before it branched, and he took the wrong branch, the one that angled left instead of right, and found himself at the edge of a wide hallway that opened through a set of prop double doors into the ballroom. He stopped. The room was enormous and luminous, the kind of space designed to make wealth feel inevitable. Crystal chandeliers the size of compact cars, round tables with white linens and low floral centerpieces. 800 people in their finest, moving through the easy choreography of charity events. A gentle hand on the arm here, a practiced laugh there, a check written with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had already decided what it would cost, and found the number acceptable. At the far end of the room, a stage. On the stage, a podium and a screen. On the screen, Naomi's face. The photograph was the one from her second year of teaching, before they had met. She was standing at a piano in a class where clearly seen better days. And she was laughing at something one of the kids had said, and the light was coming through a window behind her at an angle that made the whole image look like something from a magazine. Malcolm had never seen this photograph used publicly before. He didn't know where they had gotten it. He felt something shift inside his chest, something that was not exactly anger, but was not far from it. Delivery staff used the service corridor. He turned. Celeste Harrington was standing 6 feet away, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, wearing a gown the color of dark wine. She was 42, and looked 10 years younger because she had always been meticulous about the way she appeared in the world. She had been the one to design the foundation's first proper logo. She had been the one to approach the first corporate donors with a pitch deck that Malcolm had thought was too polished for what they were trying to do, and Naomi had laughed and said, "Let her do it her way. The kids need the money either way." Malcolm looked at her for a moment. Her expression was the particular kind of composed that takes real effort to maintain. "I just need to drop these off at the kitchen," he said. "I took the wrong hallway. Then take the right one." She glanced past him toward the nearest cluster of guests, calculating sight lines. "And please don't come into the ballroom. We have photographers tonight." "I wasn't planning to." She said nothing more. He turned toward the correct corridor. But before he moved, a man in a tuxedo near the doors caught sight of him and said, in a voice pitched for amusement, "Celeste, is he part of the entertainment?" Celeste smiled the way people smile when something requires management. "No, just a wrong turn, all sorted." A few people in earshot glanced at Malcolm with the brief, uncurious appraisal they might give a piece of furniture that had been moved slightly out of place. He knew exactly what they were registering. A tall black man in a black delivery jacket, worn sneakers, carrying bags of food, unshaved, dark circles under his eyes. No credential, no context, nothing in his appearance to prompt a second thought. He had navigated versions of this calculation his entire adult life. He had long since stopped expecting anything different. What he had not expected was the event program. One of the guests near the doorway had set hers on the edge of a nearby console table, and as Malcolm passed, he saw the front cover. He stopped. Naomi Bennett Children's Hope Foundation, 8th Annual Gala, founded by Celeste Harrington. He picked it up. The inside cover had a short biography of the foundation's history. Celeste's name appeared 4 times. Naomi's name appeared twice, each time as inspiration, as the person whose memory had moved Celeste to action. Malcolm's name did not appear at all. He stood in the hallway, holding a stranger's event program for long enough that a passing server asked if he needed directions to the kitchen. "No," he said. "Thank you. I know where I'm going." He delivered the food. He signed the receipt. He walked back through the service corridor toward the parking lot. Ava was still in the back seat, her homework folder closed now, Milo in her lap, her eyes tracking something toward the building. He opened the driver's door. "Daddy," she said. "I saw the lady on the big screen through the window." He got in and sat still for a moment. "She looked like the picture on the shelf," Ava said. "Yeah, baby, she did." Ava was quiet for a second. Then, "Why is Mommy's picture inside and we're out here?" Malcolm's hands were on the steering wheel. He didn't start the engine. Outside, a valet in a burgundy vest was parking a black sedan 50 feet away, and a couple in evening wear was climbing the front steps. The woman's laugh carrying lightly through the air. Everything looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. "Sometimes," he said finally, "people forget to invite the right ones." He started the car, but he did not leave. He sat there for 2 minutes, the engine running, the heater humming. He thought about Naomi in their kitchen, sitting on the counter with a legal pad in her lap, drawing a budget with a pencil because the pen had run dry. He thought about the first time a child had told her that he'd been hiding bread in his backpack because he didn't know if there'd be dinner at home. He thought about Grace Miller showing up with canned beans and staying for 4 years. He thought about Article 14, Paragraph 3, sitting in a box on a shelf in his closet. He thought about his daughter asking why her mother's face was on a screen in a room where her father wasn't allowed. He turned off the engine. "Stay here," he said. "I mean it this time. Right here." Ava looked at him. "Okay, Daddy." He walked back through the service entrance. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do. He knew he wasn't going to make a scene. He knew he wasn't going to walk into the ballroom and grab a microphone. That wasn't who he was. He had spent the better part of his adult life doing work that required him to leave his ego in the car, to subordinate his pride to the task, to be useful without needing credit for it. He had watched people with far less competence than him take credit for things he had built, and had let it go, because the children being fed were more important than the name above the door. But there was a line, and Celeste Harrington had crossed it when she printed his wife's name on a program and put her own name above it. He found Grace Miller before he found Celeste. Grace was 62 years old, and had the particular posture of a woman who had spent decades being underestimated, and had arrived, somewhere around 55, at a state of total peace with the gap between what people thought of her and what she actually knew. She was seated at a table near the back of the ballroom, her name card indicating a chair that faced away from the stage, which was, Malcolm understood immediately, exactly where Celeste would have placed her. Visible enough to say she'd been invited, positioned well enough away to limit her proximity to anything that mattered. Grace saw him from 20 feet away, and her face did the thing it did when she recognized something important. It went still and careful, the way a person looks when they're deciding how much of what they know to say out loud. He sat down beside her. "You got a delivery tonight," she said. "Last one for the day." She looked at his jacket. "You didn't dress up." "I wasn't planning to stay." She nodded slowly. On stage, the MC was introducing a video segment about the Foundation's impact, which was, from what Malcolm could hear, a compilation of numbers and photographs in which the actual children were blurred for privacy, but the donor names on the buildings were not. "Grace," he said quietly, "tell me you still have them." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into the handbag under her chair and produced a manila envelope. The kind that holds documents meant to last, sealed with a clip. She did not hand it to him immediately. She held it with both hands and looked at him the way you look at someone before you hand them something that cannot be undone. "I kept them because I thought one day it would matter," she said. "I didn't know it would be tonight." "Me either." She placed the envelope in his hands. He opened the clip. Inside were the original articles of incorporation for Children's Hope, filed 7 years and 8 months ago, listing Malcolm James Bennett and Naomi Grace Bennett as co-founders. There were photographs from the first Saturday at the Meridian Community Center, printed on regular copy paper, slightly faded, showing Malcolm and Naomi at their folding table, and Grace behind them, and a boy named Luis, who had eaten 3 portions of rice and beans, and put the last dinner roll in his pocket. There was a printout of an email from Celeste's personal address, dated 5 years ago, 3 months after Naomi's death, in which she had written to Malcolm, "You and Naomi built something real. Let me help keep it going while you take the time you need." And at the bottom, a copy of the Foundation bylaws, with the relevant clause highlighted in orange marker. "I highlighted it 2 years ago," Grace said. "When I figured out what she was doing, I thought about calling you, but I didn't know if you were ready." "I wasn't," he said. "Not 2 years ago." He looked up at the stage. Celeste was standing at the podium now, mid-speech, her voice warm and navigated, the kind of voice trained to hold the attention of rooms like this one. She was talking about Naomi's legacy. She was using the word "I" where the story required "we," and the word "vision" where the story required grief. Malcolm listened to her describe the night she had decided to dedicate her life to Naomi's memory. He recognized the story she was telling. It had happened to him, in his kitchen. He had told it to Celeste 3 years ago over the phone, when she had asked him to describe the Foundation's origin for a donor proposal, and she had listened carefully and taken notes, and now she was standing in front of 800 people wearing the story like a dress she had tailored to fit. He set the envelope on the table. He didn't feel the anger he had expected. What he felt was something quieter and more durable. He felt the specific weight of a man who has been patient, past the point where patience was a virtue, who has arrived at a place where continuing to say nothing is its own form of betrayal. He stood up. Grace reached out and touched his arm. "Malcolm, be careful." "I will be," he said. He was walking through the ballroom when Celeste saw him. She was mid-sentence, standing at the podium, and she caught sight of him, crossing the floor in his delivery jacket, and her voice hitched for half a second before she recovered and continued, but her eyes followed him, and the security guard near the side door saw the direction of her gaze and began moving toward Malcolm. It was Ava who changed the sequence of what happened next. She had not stayed in the car. Malcolm would learn later that she had waited approximately 4 minutes before deciding that was long enough, and had gotten out and followed the path she remembered her father taking into the building, and had been discovered by Ruth Carter in the service hallway, standing in her small sneakers, with Milo under her arm, looking through the gap in the double doors toward the ballroom. Ruth Carter was 60 years old, and had worked hotel kitchens for 31 of them, and she had seen a great many things in that time, but a 7-year-old standing alone in a service corridor was not something she was prepared to walk past. "Sweetheart," she said, "what are you doing back here?" "I'm looking for my daddy." "What does your daddy look like?" "Tall," Ava said. "Dark jacket. He brings food." Ruth looked through the gap in the doors at the ballroom, and her eyes found Malcolm crossing the floor, and she understood in the way that people understand things they haven't been told directly. She took Ava's hand and they waited. Celeste had descended from the stage by the time Malcolm reached the center of the room. Victor Langford was at her side, moving with the efficiency of a man who has spent a career managing situations before they become problems. He was 58, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, the kind of wealthy that comes with its own gravitational field. He reached Malcolm before the security guard did. "Mr. Bennett," he said, keeping his voice below the ambient sound of the room, "I think we should step to the side." "I'd rather stay here," Malcolm said. "This is a fundraising event, 800 people. We have a photographer from Metropolitan and a journalist from the Tribune." "I know. That's why I'd rather stay here." Victor's jaw tightened fractionally. Nearby guests were beginning to notice the configuration of the three of them. Victor, Celeste in her dark wine gown, and Malcolm in his delivery jacket, and were doing what guests at charity events do when they sense something inconvenient. They pretended to look elsewhere, while giving the situation their full attention. "Celeste," Malcolm said, speaking past Victor, "I'm not here to take the night from you. I'm here because my daughter just asked me why her mother's photograph is inside this building, and we're standing in the parking lot." The room shifted. Nearby conversations dropped in volume. A woman at the adjacent table turned slightly toward them. "This is not the appropriate," Celeste began. "You printed her name on the program," Malcolm said. "You put her face on the screen. You hired someone to cut her voice into the video. You used everything about her that you could find, except the part about who she actually was." He paused. "Her husband, her daughter, the people who knew what she wanted when nobody was watching." "Malcolm." Celeste's voice was precise, controlled. "You walked away. You had 4 years to be involved. I kept this foundation alive. I was keeping our daughter alive." A woman near the front table, later Malcolm would learn her name was Marianne Cole, a philanthropist who had attended the gala for the 3rd consecutive year, and had planned to write a check for $2 million, set down her glass, and turned in her chair to face them fully. "Before this evening goes any further," she said, in a voice that had clearly run many board meetings, "I'd like to understand who actually founded this organization." Victor looked at her. He looked at Malcolm. He looked at the manila envelope Grace Miller was now carrying across the room toward them. Grace set the envelope on the table beside Marianne Cole without drama. "I was there for the first meal we ever served," she said. "I am happy to describe it in detail to anyone who wants to know." The silence in the immediate vicinity of that table was the kind that spreads. Julian Price had been standing near the back of the ballroom for the past 15 minutes, with his notebook half open, invited as press to write an event recap for the Tribune's lifestyle section, and had been feeling the specific professional unease of a journalist who suspects the real story is happening in the margins of the assigned one. He had watched Malcolm cross the floor. He had watched Celeste's voice falter. He had watched Grace carry the envelope. He did not move toward Malcolm immediately. He waited until Marianne Cole opened the manila envelope and looked at the first page, and looked up with an expression that was not surprise so much as the settling of a long-held suspicion. Then Julian took 2 steps forward and said, quietly to no one in particular, "I'd like to understand what's in that envelope." Malcolm looked at him. "What are you going to do with it?" Write the truth. About the foundation. Or about a black man who was told to use the service corridor at a gala held in honor of his wife. Julian was quiet for a moment. He was 34 years old, and had been in journalism long enough to know that the story you walk in expecting and the story you walk out with are frequently different people. Both, he said, if that's what the truth is. Then write both, Malcolm said. But not my daughter. Julian nodded. Not your daughter. It was Victor who ultimately made the decision that changed the shape of the evening. He had read the incorporation documents in 3 minutes, holding them under the light of his phone, and had then stood very still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man recalculating several things at once. He was not by nature a dishonest person. He was by nature a person who preferred order and maintained it by not asking questions he suspected had inconvenient answers. He had known there was a husband in the background. He had allowed himself to believe that Malcolm's distance from the foundation was voluntary and total. The bylaws were not ambiguous. Victor walked to the edge of the stage and took the microphone from the MC with a quiet word. He did not explain to the room what was happening, in the way a politician explains. He said only that due to new information that had come to light regarding the foundation's governance structure, the program would pause for 1 hour, and that he wanted to personally apologize to anyone who had come here tonight in genuine good faith, because the foundation's mission was real and deserved to be treated as such. The room erupted, briefly and quietly, into the low-level turbulence that 800 people produce when their evening is unexpectedly redirected. Celeste moved toward the microphone. Victor stepped between her and it. "Celeste," he said, "I need you to give me an hour." She looked at him with an expression that was not quite disbelief because it contained too much calculation. "Victor, if you do this—" "I'm not doing anything," he said. "I'm finding out what's true." She stood at the edge of the stage for a long moment. Below her, Malcolm was standing with his hands at his sides, saying nothing, which she had always found the most difficult thing about him. He never argued in the way you could argue back with. He simply stood in the fact of what he knew and let it do the work. The double doors at the side of the ballroom opened, and Ruth Carter walked in with a 7-year-old girl holding a stuffed rabbit with a missing left ear. Ava saw her father before he saw her. She walked to him through the open space between the tables and took his hand, and he looked down at her and said, quietly, "I told you to stay in the car." "You were gone for a long time," she said. He crouched down to her level. She was looking past him at the screen above the stage, where Naomi's photograph still glowed in soft light, the image from the classroom, with the piano, the light coming through the window, the mid-law. "That's Mommy," Ava said. "Yeah." She looked at him. "Are you going to tell them about her?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "If you want me to." She thought about this with the gravity that 7-year-olds bring to decisions they understand to be important. She looked at the room around them, the guests at the tables, the lights, the backdrop with the foundation's name in silver letters, the space where Celeste had been standing. She looked back at her father. "Tell them the true story," she said. "Not the fancy one." He stood up. They moved him through a side corridor and then back to the stage, and he walked up the 3 steps in his delivery jacket and his worn sneakers, and stood at the podium where Celeste had stood 40 minutes before, and looked out at a room that had spent the last hour waiting to understand what was happening. He was not a man who had ever wanted a microphone. He was the kind of man who preferred to be useful over being visible, who had spent 12 years doing work that required showing up in places no one was celebrating, and making things better in ways that rarely made the news. He was 42 inches from his wife's face on the screen behind him, and he looked at it for 1 second before he looked at the room. "My name is Malcolm Bennett," he said. "The woman on this screen was my wife." The room was completely quiet. "I didn't come here tonight to speak to 800 people. I came because I had a food delivery, and my daughter was in the back seat, and this was the last stop of the night." He paused. "But I picked up a program on my way in." He did not perform the story he told. He did not modulate his voice for drama, or let it break at the moments where breaking would be most effective. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has been carrying something heavy long enough that the weight of it has become ordinary. And when he finally sets it down in front of other people, the absence of the weight is its own kind of statement. He told them about the kitchen, the 40 containers of rice and beans, Naomi on the counter with her legal pad, Luis, who was 8 years old and ate 3 portions and put the dinner roll in his pocket, Tasha, who had never touched a piano until Naomi got a donated upright Yamaha into the community center, and spent 6 Saturday mornings teaching her a song that she played at her elementary school recital in the spring, the friends they had called to donate old winter coats, the evenings they had stayed up late, putting stamps on donation letters that went to churches and community organizations, because they couldn't afford a mailing service. The morning Naomi was diagnosed, 3 months after the foundation had received its first real grant, and the way she had looked at him across the kitchen table and said, "Make sure the kids keep eating, Malcolm. That's the whole thing. That's all of it." He told them about Celeste joining, and the way she had helped, and the things she had genuinely built. He didn't strip her of credit she had earned, but he told them what she had taken. He told them about the bylaws and Article 14, Paragraph 3. He told them about finding the program and seeing who had been erased. He told them what it cost a 7-year-old girl to look at her mother's photograph on a 40-foot screen, in a room where she was not welcome. He stopped there. The room stayed quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then Ava, who had come to stand beside Grace at the foot of the stage, pulled on Grace's hand and looked up at her and said something. Grace bent toward her. Ava said it again. Grace straightened and looked at Malcolm, and made a small gesture with her hand. He crouched at the edge of the stage. "What is it, baby?" Ava looked at the room. She looked at her mother's photograph. She looked at her father. "Mommy would want kids to eat first," she said. Malcolm stayed crouched for a second, then he stood. "That's all she would say if she could be here," he said to the room. "The rest is what we do about it." Victor Langford stood in the wings and felt something that was unfamiliar and clarifying at the same time. He was a man who had attended 47 charity galas in the last decade, and had written checks at 23 of them, and had never once questioned whether the institution receiving his money was aligned with the thing it claimed to be. He had never asked, because the events were always so well produced that the question felt impolite. He understood, for the first time that evening, that this was precisely the mechanism by which the question went unasked. He went to find Celeste. She was in the hallway off the kitchen, her phone in her hand, already calling someone. She ended the call when she saw him. "Victor, the program is paused," he said. "I'm suspending your operational authority pending a full review of the Foundation's governance and financial history. We'll convene a board session Monday morning with the Foundation's attorney." "You can't do this." The donors watched a man in a delivery jacket tell them the truth about something we've been presenting inaccurately for 2 years. "You know what wealthy people hate? Being taken for fools." She was quiet. "I kept this foundation alive," she said finally. "I raised $7 million, and now we need to find out how much of it, where it was supposed to go." He said it without anger. "Go home, Celeste. We'll talk Monday." He turned and walked back toward the ballroom. She stood in the hallway for a long time, holding her phone, looking at the wall. Outside, she could hear the sound of the gala resuming in a different key than it had started. Conversations instead of programming. The particular low buzz of a room that is no longer being managed, and is instead deciding what it actually believes. The confrontation, when it came, was quieter than anyone might have expected. It happened in the green room, behind the stage. The space where speakers wait before going on, now cleared of everyone except Malcolm and Celeste, and the particular weight of 8 years of accumulated wrong decisions. "You made me the villain," she said. "In front of everyone who matters in this city." "I stood in the room," Malcolm said. "You were already the thing you chose to be. I kept the foundation going when you disappeared. I didn't disappear. I was 3 blocks away raising the child you haven't asked about once in 4 years." She looked away. "You could have called me," he said. "Any of those times you were changing the website, any of those board meetings you stopped inviting me to, any of those times you signed off on removing my name from the founding documents. You could have called and asked if it was okay. I might have said yes, because I was drowning and you were keeping the lights on, and there was a part of me that was grateful enough to let a lot of things go." He stopped. "But you didn't ask," he said. "You just took. And you kept taking until there was nothing left with Naomi's name on it that had anything to do with what she actually was." Celeste was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower than it had been. "I loved her too," she said. "In my way." "I know you did," Malcolm said. "But you loved the idea of her more than you loved what she wanted. And she wanted kids to eat dinner, not champagne." He left her there. The Monday board meeting lasted 4.5 hours. Malcolm arrived in a pressed shirt, having arranged for Ava's grandmother to take her to school. Grace was already there when he arrived, seated at the conference table with her manila envelope and a cup of tea. Looking like a woman who had been waiting for this particular meeting for 2 years and was not going to rush it. The Foundation's attorney had spent the weekend reviewing the original incorporation documents and bylaws, and his conclusion was straightforward. Malcolm Bennett held co-founder status and retained, under Article 14, both moral rights and legal authority over the use of Naomi Bennett's name and image. Celeste Harrington's assumption of the founder designation in public-facing materials had no legal grounding and constituted, at minimum, a breach of fiduciary duty. The discussion of what happened next took most of the morning. Malcolm's contentions were clear, and he delivered them without theater. He wanted the Foundation's historical record corrected in all public materials, website, annual reports, gala programs, press releases. Every document that had listed Celeste Harrington as founder would be amended to reflect the actual founding history. Every instance where Naomi had been described as inspiration rather than co-founder would be corrected. He wanted a public statement acknowledging the erasure and apologizing for it. He wanted the Foundation's budget restructured so that no less than 0.0% of every dollar raised went directly to programmatic work. Food, education, housing support. Not events, not photography, not marketing, not $600 table linens. He wanted the after-school meal program reinstated within 30 days. It had been suspended 18 months ago because Celeste had determined it was insufficiently photogenic for donor presentations. He wanted Grace Miller restored to the board. He wanted a community kitchen established in Naomi's name, not a ballroom, not a gala venue, not a donor lounge, but an actual kitchen in a community center where volunteers would cook and serve, and where children and families could come without an invitation. He wanted Celeste Harrington removed from operational leadership, pending an independent ethics review. And he wanted to retain the role of mission trustee, a title he and the attorney devised together, which gave him no administrative duties but full veto power over any use of Naomi's name or image in perpetuity. Victor Langford listened to all of this, and then asked one question. "Do you want an executive position? Director? Co-chair? Something with regular hours?" Malcolm thought about this for a moment. "I want to keep my daughter's bedtime," he said, "and I want to keep my word to my wife. If those two things can coexist with a title, then fine. If the title gets in the way of either one of them, I don't need it." Victor nodded slowly. The independent review of Celeste's financial stewardship took 6 weeks. It found no evidence of outright theft. It found substantial evidence of systematic redirection of resources from programmatic work to overhead, event production, and the cultivation of Celeste's personal professional profile. It found that the after-school meal program had been cut not for strategic reasons but because its continuation had begun to conflict with the image the Foundation was cultivating for high-net-worth donor audiences. Celeste resigned before the review was finalized. She did not issue a statement. She was barred by legal agreement from using Naomi Bennett's name in any future professional context. 3 months after the gala, on a Saturday morning in November, the Naomi Bennett Community Kitchen opened in the Meridian Community Center on the east side of the city. It was the same community center where Malcolm and Naomi had served their first 40 meals of rice and beans 8 years earlier. The kitchen had been refurbished with a portion of the funds raised at the gala after a round of donor communications in which Julian Price's article in the Tribune had played a clarifying role. There were no chandeliers, no backdrop, no champagne. There were long folding tables arranged in 2 rows. There was a buffet line serving roasted chicken and green beans, and soft rolls and fruit cups. There were 47 children in various states of appetite and volume, doing what children do when there is food and space and no particular requirement to be quiet about it. There were 12 volunteers, most of them people who had worked with Naomi and Malcolm in the early years, and who had shown up again without being asked twice. There was Grace Miller in a Naomi Bennett Foundation apron, directing a young man in the correct loading procedure for industrial sheet pans, with the precision of someone who had been doing this since before he was born. Victor Langford was there, in a flannel shirt with his sleeves rolled to the elbow, doing a genuinely poor job of ladling soup, but doing it with the specific willingness of a man who has decided that appearing competent is less important than appearing present. Julian Price was there, notebook closed, eating a dinner roll at the end of one of the tables, watching the room with the expression of a journalist who has decided that some stories are better lived than documented. Ruth Carter was in the kitchen because of course she was. She had shown up at 7 in the morning with 2 boxes of donated produce and had simply begun washing vegetables, and no one had thought to ask why she was there, because her being there seemed exactly right. On the wall above the serving line, there was a framed photograph of Naomi Bennett, not the theatrical one from the gala, with the soft light and the piano and the angled gold. This one was the copy paper print from the first Saturday at this same building. Naomi in jeans and a sweatshirt, pointing at the camera with a wooden spoon, laughing, with Malcolm just visible at the edge of the frame, and Grace Miller behind them both. Beneath the photograph was a single line, printed in plain lettering on plain paper. Kindness should arrive before the camera. Malcolm was at the stove. He wore a dark apron, and he was doing what he had always done best in these spaces, managing the flow of the room quietly, filling gaps before they became problems, watching the children at the tables, with the particular attention of a man for whom each of those faces carries a specific and serious weight. Ava was standing on a small step stool beside him, her job being to place dinner rolls one by one into a basket, which she was doing with the focused concentration of someone who takes this responsibility seriously. Milo was propped against the wall behind her, watching. Ruth came to stand at the pass between the kitchen and the serving line, and looked out at the room for a moment. "First time I met the 2 of you," she said. "I just thought, that child shouldn't be sitting alone in a car." Malcolm handed a serving spoon to a volunteer. "That's the right instinct. I didn't know anything else about you. You didn't need to," he said. "That's how it should work." Ruth considered this. She went to the produce station. Ava looked up from the roll basket. She had noticed the photograph on the wall, as she did every time she was in the room, with the particular attention of a child for whom that face is not a symbol but a person. "Daddy," she said. "Yeah. Mommy looks happier here than she did on the big screen." He looked at the photograph. Naomi with the wooden spoon, laughing, surrounded by nothing except the work. "Why do you think that is?" Ava put another roll in the basket. She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to all important questions. "Because there are kids eating," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, baby, that's exactly it." Later, after the last tray was cleared, and the folding tables were wiped down, and the children had gone home in the company of parents and guardians, and a few workers from the city's family services office, Malcolm stood in the parking lot with Ava beside him, the 2 of them leaning against his car in the November dark. Ava was holding a container of leftover rice that Ruth had pressed into her hands before they left, because Ruth was the kind of person who could not let anyone leave a kitchen hungry, even if they had just spent 3 hours helping to feed other people. "Daddy," Ava said, "today we delivered food, right?" He looked down at her. She was watching him with the particular patient expression she had inherited from her mother, the one that meant she already knew the answer and wanted to see if he would find the same one. "No, baby," he said. "Today we brought it home." She considered this, turning it over the way she did with things that mattered. "Mommy would like that," she said. The night was cold and clear. Somewhere in the city a siren moved through the distance and faded. Malcolm put his hand on his daughter's shoulder and felt the extraordinary solidity of her there beside him, warm and real and entirely herself. "Yeah," he said, "she would. There are rooms built to celebrate kindness that have never once held a hungry child. There are stages dressed in light for the purpose of honoring people who are not there to hear it. There are programs printed with names arranged to tell a version of the story that the people who lived it would not recognize. And then there are kitchens. There are long tables and folding chairs, and the noise of children who have not been asked to be quiet. There are people who show up at 7 in the morning with vegetables and no explanation. There are 7-year-olds standing on step stools, placing dinner rolls in a basket with the gravity of important work. There are photographs on walls that show the truth of things, not because they were taken carefully, but because the moment they captured was real. Malcolm Bennett did not walk into that gala to reclaim his wife's legacy. He walked in because it was the last delivery of the night, and his daughter was in the back seat. What he reclaimed because the cost of not doing so had finally become larger than the cost of the fight. He had been patient in the way that a man is patient, when patience is the only thing that keeps him from losing himself entirely. When it finally broke, it broke not with fury, but with clarity, the particular clarity of someone who has been waiting for the moment to arrive and, when it does, meets it without performance. Naomi Bennett wanted children to have dinner before anything else, before the speeches, before the photography, before the check was written, or the plaque was hung, or the backdrop was illuminated. She wanted a table, and food on it, and a child sitting down to eat. That is what her husband gave her. Not a ballroom, not a campaign, not a brand. A kitchen, a photograph, a roll in a basket placed by small, careful hands. That is what it looks like when the work comes before the name.